At first, the slave war began slowly, proceeding in a sleepwalk fashion as though thought up by some groggy dreamer. The armies of Xiaojin beat their drums and sounded their trumpets as they crossed Poyang's border, capturing the west, and Poyang's noble cavalry charges crashed against their lines and began to push them back. But beside these opening months, it was as though they forgot what exactly to do. Xiaojin set up a nigh-impenetrable trench along the front line, which glittered with orange sparks and sent a black haze into the sky, while the vast army of princelings and noblemen sat astride their fine horses and polished their rifles, themselves a work of art. And they did so for months. Indeed, even until the close of 1856. During this time, events around the world continued on, as though this brewing conflict had nothing to do with them. Indeed, the slave trade even picked up during this time, with the fleet of Xiaojin nowhere to be seen, assumed to have returned to their ports for maintenance, or even to be called elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Japan, controversy surrounding the Heihachi shogunate began to reach a fever pitch, and demanded a solution. The emperor, who had not been seen since his overthrow, was presumed dead by the people. But the shogun was not a stupid man. He knew he couldn't replace a demigod and get away with it so easily. And so, with various temples worth of holy men at his back, he disseminated that Japan had lost the favor of Amaterasu after generations of decadence and godlessness, due in large part to the decadence of the imperial court. How else could the invasion of Liuzhou be explained other than divine abandonment? A goddess had abandoned Japan. Not all was lost, however. Indeed, another god came to save the country, both from itself and the outside forces which angled to destroy it. This god was Amaterasu's rebellious brother, the god of storms, Susanoo. So impetuous and rootless for uncounted generations, even he couldn't abandon Japan, and finally grew into maturity via his role as its protector. The conditions of his protection were to depose the demigod emperor, and to establish a non-hereditary office based on martial rank, earned through prowess and skill. And so the Heihachi shogunate was born, and Heihachi himself would come to be known colloquially as the Blue Emperor for his new association with storms and the sea. This explanation satisfied enough people to hold the country together, and they rallied under Susanoo's divine representative. Of course, the shogun had to explain devastating storms and tsunamis as penance, carrying away the degenerate and disloyal to the depths. Also during this time, the countries of Northern Europe, which carried on in their worship of the old gods and resistance of Rome, formed an alliance between them, known as the Wotansloa, translated as Wotan's League. 1857 continued in the same quiet manner until February of that year. At the long, stagnant western front, Xiaojin's line suddenly erupted in fire and fury, and Poyang's encampments were obliterated in what seemed to them like an instant. Xiaojin's new military-industrial government had revolutionized the cannon, inventing something called the TAB, or Iron Arm. This new cannon functioned in such a way that the barrel itself was precisely rifled, and the ordnance itself coated in a thin layer of lead. As such, when it was loaded from the breech, the fact that it was slightly too large for the barrel caused such pressure to act on the rifling, resulting in an incredibly accurate long-range shot. Indeed, the fact that these could be loaded from the breech also meant that they could be reloaded more safely and effectively than other cannons at the time. The TAB could even be angled upwards and downwards via some intricate mechanism, and through complicated calculations strike a specific area up to 3 miles away in the right conditions. At shorter distances, they even innovated explosive rounds, which themselves detonated on impact, but these were far less reliable. The fact of the matter was that Xiaojin had revolutionized the cannon, and warfare itself, introducing to the world what could more properly be called artillery. And so, as these soldiers emerged from their trenches and walked across 1.5 miles of muddy devastation, building a new trench and waiting for their next move, all the moving pieces began to fall into place. In horrible conjunction with this, a new innovation from Poyang gave the world a new glimpse into the horror of war. Photography had existed in some form since the 1810s, invented by Kai Chen in the city of Wenzhou. The first photograph ever taken was of the city's great lighthouse on an island in the bay. The issue with photography was, for a long time, that it was expensive and extremely fragile. The first pictures, unless immediately framed, would become discolored by the sun or even broken down by the humidity in the air over the course of a couple hours. So, photography remained the purview of the gentlemanly elite until it was finally stabilized in 1857, just as Kai Chen's beloved home city was being set aflame by the armies of Xiaojin. He captured the first photos of war, and these photos were the first to be published in newspapers across Asia. It was these pictures that made the conflict worldwide. The cold, calculated, mechanized warfare of Xiaojin shocked the world, with photos of bloated corpses and scattered limbs being seen by the public for the very first time. As such, other great powers began to join. Gaizhou, seeing this war as an opportunity to secure a powerful ally, aligned itself with Xiaojin. Laizhou, seeing the war itself as barbarous and inhumane, invaded Xiaojin from the north, opening up another front and countering Gaizhou. Namning, an empire which was particularly slave-centric, put its differences with Poyang aside and joined the war in support of them, or, more fairly, in support of slavery as an institution. Urad supported Poyang as an excuse to invade Gaizhou, while its neighbor to the west, Mongolistan, was convinced by the abolitionist theological arguments made by Xiaojin, and joined the war on their side against Poyang. And so, the dance of global war went much the same way as last time. Phrygia, desperate to drive Mongolistan beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, declared war on them, vicariously lending their support to Poyang and therefore slavery. Serdia came to the support of Mongolistan and invaded Phrygia. This prompted an invasion from Ordovisia, which Bax joined. Serdia then called on its allies in Avarignia and Tribalia. Phrygia then declared war on Bax and Ordovisia, joining in on that venerable anti-Roman alliance with Avarignia and the others. This caused Rome, in conjunction with Avarignia and Samogitia, to launch an invasion against this alliance. That prompted the Wotansloa to launch a great assault on Rome and her allies in an attempt to gain total victory over their ancestral lands. Toro, having kept careful tabs on the situation, used the technical idea that Avarignia was fighting alongside powers which wished to abolish slavery as an excuse to invade their great northern rival. The Hayashi shogunate, seeing their opportunity to reclaim the Lost Islands, declared war on Laizhou, and entered the war on the side of Xiaojin. Finally, Rajasthan invaded the Central Asian states of Tianshui and Mangkuang in an attempt to use this chaos to rejoin the great powers, and was indeed on nobody's side in the slave war of 1856. As such, the abolitionist coalition was headed by Xiaojin and consisted of Gaizhou, Mongolistan, the Hayashi shogunate, Serdia, Avarignia, Tribalia, Phrygia, Norland, Angland, Gwynedd, and Iskland, while the slaver coalition was headed by Poyang and consisted of Laizhou, Namning, Urad, Phrygia, Ordovisia, Bax, Rome, Avarignia, Samogitia, and Toro. Indeed, while in the east the war was definitively about slavery, in the west it was a reignition of that old Roman divide which flared up whenever it had provocation enough to do so. Zarathurma, meanwhile, was uninvolved. Instead, the Pirate Republic decided to sit aside and bide its time, working on the state of its government and the state of its military. Little did it know, however, the role it would play in this war regardless. Thus ensued the Slave War, the bloodiest war the world had yet known. In Asia, the war was characterized by jolting bursts of activity, followed by months or sometimes years of trench warfare. Notable battles and engagements were as follows. First, in July of 1857, the Battle of Nanchang occurred without delay. The capital of Poyang, which sat on the border with Xiaojin, was almost guaranteed to become a war zone. However, nestled between several mountains and flanked by a lake to their east, it was an easily defensible city and mostly safe from Xiaojin's artillery. Poyang gave charge of the city to General Kang Chen, who blew the bridge at the river near the border and blockaded the road. However, Xiaojin, the most industrialized country of its age, had a statistical advantage you could count on: bodies. As child mortality plummeted but childbirth remained high, a demographic dividend in the form of millions of young men came to bear for war. So the premier general of the front for Xiaojin, Jin Xiaoli, made use of this. He sent an infantry detachment to forge the river directly ahead, and also sent a series of small ships out on the eastern lake to harass the city. General Kang wasted no time in sinking these minor vessels and held the frontal attackers at bay. What he didn't count on, however, was the wide and forested valley to his west. Indeed, General Kang did fortify this region, but not well enough. Roughly 2 weeks after the siege began, a night assault came rushing in from the west and smashed into the city of Nanchang. Shelling and fighting by the city's western flank continued for 3 weeks before General Jin's men breached its defenses. They took hold of the city's western quarter, home to food processing plants and canneries, giving them secure access to food. General Kong attempted to flank them, sending men south on the railroad, rounding the southwestern mountains, cutting off their supply lines, and boxing them in. Roughly 2 weeks later, this maneuver actually succeeded, but it was too little, too late. All this managed to do was drive the enemy infantry into a wild charge, bursting into the rest of the city. After another week of urban warfare, the capital city of Poyang fell, and General Jin took control of the city. By March of 1859, the Battle of Nanchang Plains occurred. General Zhao Aiguo of Poyang oversaw the reconquest of western Poyang, but was once again faced with a front of many miles in the north, where Xiaojin's prized general, Jin Zhaoli, was tasked with recapturing the west. This front had devolved into trench warfare for the past year, characterized by scrambling infantry charges over the barren wastes between. However, one of the main trenches in Xiaojin's local network lay near a river. Of course, no man could sail down it towards Poyang's position, as such a thing would be suicide. However, if it were to be dammed, and subsequently burst, the resulting flood could cause the river to burst its banks downstream by the major city of Chongqing, and in so doing cause a breakdown of the supply lines coming from the city. As such, for the whole year of 1858, a dam was built along the river and its reservoir dramatically overfilled. However, a storm caused it to burst before Xiaojin was ready, causing a catastrophic flood which burst the banks of the entire river, all the way from their own trenches down to the city of Chongqing itself, taking the lives of 200,000 people in the process, a quarter of them belonging to Xiaojin. Such chaos benefited no one, and the planned southern advance not only failed to materialize, a counteroffensive on the part of General Zhao trudged through the muddy mess until they pierced their northern front, capturing the city of Guangyan, the first major victory on the part of Poyang. Later that year, in December of 1859, the Tenasserim campaign got underway. General Wang Zifan of Namning, with a combined force of Namning jungle infantry and enslaved soldiers called Lianbing, or chained soldiers. Lianbing were typically raised from childhood to kill, and saw the Huangdi not only as their direct owner, but also as their imperial father, for whom they relinquished their freedom from birth. Of course, those who did not play along were themselves swiftly killed, so it remains to be seen how much of this engendered loyalty was natural. Regardless, these were the kind of men General Wang Zi had at his disposal, and it was with these men that he led an assault on Xiaojin's holding in the south of Tenasserim, defended by its colonial governor, Bai Bohai. Governor Bai was an older man, well into his 50s, and expected to die peacefully in his office. That is why he was shocked when several regiments of Lianbing came knocking down his door. General Wang Zi made great advancements at the start of the campaign, but was quickly forced back into a stalemate which lasted about a year. Then, the tide began to turn as Governor Bai used tunnelers to dig under their encampments and ruin the integrity of the soil. Sure enough, when monsoon season came, the land gave way to mud and even opened up in sinkholes faster than they could adapt. Governor Bin then killed them where they writhed. From then until 1861, Governor Bin sailed up the coast and used ships to advance, eventually conquering all the way up to the gates of Bangkok. Meanwhile, during the entire course of the war, the Hayashi shogunate embarked on the Scattered Gems campaign. Under the command of the so-called Blue Emperor himself, nearly the entirety of the Japanese army rallied in the south. They were supplied and trained by officers from Gaizhou, and over the course of the war largely brought them up to speed with the rest of Asia, their stolen technology aside. From this position of strength, Japan pursued an offensive campaign against the occupiers, who were headed by the ruthless General Ren Xiaodan. General Ren was widely known for torture and public executions, taking pleasure in his power over the local peoples. Indeed, his style of governance even influenced Lai Zhou's colonial policy abroad in places like Pengnan. Regardless, the fighting of the Scattered Gems campaign was characterized by the Japanese harassing his larger force from the periphery, while he attempted these grand assaults that earned him many skulls but no land whatsoever. This dance would continue all the way to Taiwan, where he was only just able to fend off their ships. And so, such was the main theater in Asia. However, this was a global war, there was much more to see. The front between Mongolistan and Urad was much more fluid, characterized by riflemen on horseback galloping over the steppe. One such military program to best characterize it was the Dunsgaria campaign, which from 1859 to 1862 saw two generals fight over 130 separate battles consisting of over 1,000 men each, and hundreds more skirmishes below that number. These men were Mongolistan's General Delgar Odgarel and Urad's General Bat Erdena Ayush. The two would send out swift scouts to spot their enemy, and then it became a race to see who could catch the other off guard first. In the wide plains and desert mountains of Dunsgaria, the advantage went to the attacker every time. It is estimated that 50,000 people died during the course of that campaign, not including civilians whose towns and homes were often raided by their respective enemies over the border. The Hail campaign, taking place in the blistering deserts of Mesopotamia, was a stalemate the entire war, but horrific nonetheless. The Mongols, under General Elbek Oydov, manned their great desert wall, as seemingly endless waves of Phrygian soldiers crashed against them, led by the paranoid General Apellikon. Neither side was well suited to such a conflict, but whoever broke first would surely lose. Lacking the proper ordnance to crack the Mongol walls, the Phrygians did excel in explosive anti-personnel ordnance, which they lobbed over the walls using what were essentially glorified trebuchets. This actually did cause great chaos behind the walls. The Mongols, meanwhile, used their highly accurate marksmen to take down targets from a great distance, playing to their strengths. On three separate occasions, in 1860, 1862, and 1865, General Apellikon made it behind Mongol lines, personally killing dozens of men each time before escaping. This was, save for 1865, when he was captured and his head displayed on a spike above the gates. Europe itself was broadly chaotic, with Rome pressing out in all directions and its enemies pressing in from all directions. However, something of particular note came to a head in Avarignia in 1863. The war with the Romans in North Africa was proving to be an exhausting task and ran the coffers empty. Avarignia even began to run out of people to fight and had to begin drafting men over the age of 35. This caused an uprising in North Africa, where much of the fighting was taking place, headed by a man named Larza Indicidis de Ostum. Hailing from the Indicidi line, which never left Avarignia and had since served the empire in the role of generals and high officers, Larza saw his chance to unseat his cousins. This civil war would last until the end of the wider conflict and take Avarignia out of the war, ultimately resulting in Avarignia being split between two kingdoms defined as North and South. Interestingly enough, the man in charge of the Roman North Africa campaign which triggered such a war was General Thocaro Indicidis de Chelia, hailing from the line which conquered Sardinia all those years ago. A bizarre and unwelcome family reunion, if ever there was one. Such pressure was also exerted on Avarignia from Toro, but they were able to be held back, unlike the Romans, who were the premier force of Europe at the time. However, it was in 1866 that Europe truly paid a price for this war. Asia, seeking not only to draw up more resources for itself, but also strike at whatever enemies it had on the other side of the world, launched a series of incursions into Europe itself. Shaojin, for example, began this trend by staging an invasion of Roman Hibernia near Galway. The ironclad ships of Admiral Fan Gui Ren demonstrated a new technology from their deck, the repeating gun. 6 large barrels, manually turned by a crank, resulted in a rate of fire unlike anything seen before. It tore the city and its defenses to shreds, and Shaojin soon took the entire island. This was the same for the Roman lowlands, and Samogisha too. The slaver powers came later, with Poyang taking bites out of Avarignia and Tribalia, Nam Ning establishing a base on the Isle of Corsica, and Lai Zhou doing the same with Toro. Finally, the New World saw the dregs of the conflict, with many orders coming late and bogged down by the native element in the north and dense jungle in the south. However, fighting still occurred and was especially fierce on the border between Shikoor and Lacandon, as well as Kalama and Gaizhou's southernmost holdings in Pengnan. This is where Zarathurma came in. This global war largely shut down shipping lanes, and many people around the world were broadly shut out from goods they'd expected and even relied upon before. As such, Zarathurma became the nexus of a global smuggling empire, which made it wealthier than it had ever yet been. It ran sugar to Europe, grain to Kalama, gunpowder to the Huron, ship parts to Phrygia, slaves to Lai Zhou, raw metals to Rajasthan, and even gold to Mongolistan. But the war couldn't go on forever. Shaojin's industry provided them the edge and led to a general breakdown of Poyang's aristocratic agrarian slaver alliance, leading to the Treaty of Hefei on September 5th, 1876. Overall, the war lasted 20 years, from 1856 to 1876, and resulted in a final death toll of 40 million dead, bringing the global population back below 1 billion for the first time since the end of the Great Peace. An unimaginable ocean of blood, catalogued in all its gory detail. Indeed, these were the birthing pains of a new world on the other side of it. Shaojin achieved its initial goal of forcing the point of abolition, leading to its wholesale abandonment in Asia and repatriation of several million slaves to their ancestral places of origin. Interestingly, this led to significant communities of Chinese speakers in Pengbei, Pengnan, and Africa, who also brought back with them some knowledge of agricultural methods used in the East. Besides leading to an economic recession in all the former slave economies, Shaojin and her allies also made huge territorial gains. Europe was also unrecognizable, with colonies scattered throughout the continent, and a Rome which was at once resurgent against its neighbors and imposed upon by Chinese influence. Then, in the New World, Shaojin became the dominant colonial power, with the famed Knights of the Flame entering their service. Zaratherma also emerged as the wealthiest country in the world at the time, unscathed by war, and ready to use this newfound prosperity against a world which had, for centuries, denied it influence. Slavery would persist for a few more years in the West before Shaojin managed to force abolition upon them, too. The final bastions of slavery would be the clandestine trade of humans via Zaratherma and the open sacrifice of them in Toro. Toro was, however, beginning to crumple in on itself, denied its only source of revenue. It was said that thousands were sacrificed in the capital as a combined coalition of the Chinese great powers came to bear against them, with the intent of dismantling them once and for all. As the world shook itself awake from what seemed like a nightmare of impossible brutality, it would enter a reality that seemed stained with blood, and unsure of what it was before it slept. As industrialism came to sweep the globe, what people imagined they knew about reality itself would be challenged in the face of new hells wrought by the hands of man.